Let's get started. I am Michael Jacobson. I'm the research coordinator, and this is Rick Eberhardt, who is the studio manager for the MIT Game Lab. And we are going to talk about better board games through cultural engagement. Together with the game designer, historian, artist Mary Flanagan, I'm working on a book about colonial themes in board games. And she is focusing on games from the colonial era, so roughly late 15th century to mid 20th century, while I study contemporary board games, so roughly the last 25 years or so, with colonial themes. You can see some of them up on the screen. And as you try to figure out if any of your designs are up there, I want to take this moment to make clear that we aren't here to try to shame anyone for making these games. We very much think of this as a systemic issue, and we are all part of the same system, but we at the same time think that there is a need to do something about these things. We don't assume that any game designers have any malicious intent by doing these kinds of themes, and we're certainly not interested in calling out people. And on top of all of that, some of the games that we've been playing for this study are actually what we consider good examples or good use of thematic content, so there's that as well. Well, it turns out that this theme is very popular in modern board games. When you as a gamer starts thinking about it, you realize that it's kind of everywhere. So together with colleagues and students in the lab, I played over 140 games for this study, and we have acquired another 100-something games that are still waiting to be played and analyzed. On top of that, we've learned through the study that there are more and more of these games coming out every year. There's a lot of them. Okay, so the next couple of slides will have some harsh racist imagery in them, so I just wanted to give a little heads up that this can be upsetting, especially to people of color, but we do think that it's important to show these images. So colonialism was bad. It was like really, really bad. There were massacres, concentration camps, deliberate famines, spreading of disease, and of course slavery. And there was also something called human zoos, which we have some images of here, and it's exactly what you would think it was. And to me, these zoos were the ultimate expression of the dehumanizing ethos of the colonialist era. So why do we keep making games with these themes? Well, just speaking for myself, I grew up in northern Sweden in the 70s and 80s, and whitewashed colonial narratives and racist stereotypes of the other were everywhere. It was in the comic books I read, the toys I played with, the history books in school, the games I played, and even the candy I ate. So the colonialist mindset dominated my cultural environment so much that I never questioned that narrative that I was immersed in. Another thing is that the games aren't really about the events and places that they purport to be depicting. The colonialist settings are usually just used as a playground for Western heroes, which are played by the players, to explore, conquer, exploit, and fight in. While the indigenous peoples are represented as resources or obstacles or exotic flavor and have very little agency, and the narratives are basically false narratives that are very much romanticized. So it is turned into some kind of palatable entertainment, at least for white people. Colonialism continues to be the water we swim in. And this is reflected in the games we make and play still today. While we keep playing whitewashed, false, and romanticized colonialist narratives, like the game Puerto Rico, the real Puerto Rico is still a colony being exploited by the United States. We need to reflect critically on our work as we create these cultural artifacts, because it does matter which messages we inscribe within them, whether it's intentional or not. So we wanted to try to make some kind of change ourselves, but we don't know anything else than how to make games. So although we understand the limitations of our approach, going back to what I said about this being a systemic issue, we decided to go to Latin America and make games with people who are from these places that these games are supposedly about.
All right, so I'll be talking about the workshops and the products of the workshops we've run, in which we've tried to make counter-colonialist games, or at the very least, tried to not repeat the mistakes made by most designers when they make games about these regions. For us, counter-colonialism means that we are still engaging with the results of colonialism, but rather than resupporting that value system, we're trying to either counteract it or at least show perspectives beyond that of the colonizer, which most of those games are generally about. As mentioned, we're looking at two specific regions in Latin America. That's Colombia and Puerto Rico. Our process involved workshops where we discussed games ostensibly about the region, played exemplar games, which we felt pointed towards mechanics or interactions which we considered interesting and outside the norm. And in this picture here, we've got two that we liked. The Grizzled, made by Fabian Ruffo and Juan Rodriguez, and arranged by Nasha Balamguala. And then after that, we conducted brainstorming, team building, and prototyping exercise based on the time that we had available with our participants. So our first, in Colombia, we partnered with the Universidad de los Andes to make games for social impact, providing a 2-week prototyping workshop that was part of a 2-month video game design class. And our goals were twofold. First, we were to teach and support a group of students in game design techniques, and second, to learn from them about Latin American culture and issues as it relates to our counter-colonist project. And our participants came from varied backgrounds, including computer science and game design, but also economics, media production, and information technology. And we started the workshop with a discussion of issues that we, as the combined MIT and Colombian faculty, felt were of importance to Colombian citizens. The project was run by Pablo Figueroa, a professor at the university. We started with a talk from the Dean of the School of Law, Catalina Botero, to talk about the rights outlined in the Colombian Constitution that citizens enjoy, and the impact and issues surrounding the peace process and the mobilization of the FARC, ending or attempting to end a long period of war and strife in the area. One of our participants even came from one of the camps. He worked as an aid worker working with ex-FARC, actually playing games with them. He often played Monopoly with them, he said. But for the most part, our participants were urban dwellers, and so most of the games and most of the things we actually made during this workshop focused to issues specific to life in the capital city of Bogota. So I'd like to take the time to highlight one of the prototypes made that we felt could only result from a participatory design process like this. This is La Guerra del Centavo, roughly the War of the Penny, about being a bus driver in Bogota, specifically the independent minibuses, not the newer but equally problematic Transmillennial service. And among Bogotans, these minibuses are often considered dangerous and unreliable. Passengers blame the individual drivers for behavior that are actually encouraged by the system that the drivers are stuck within. But for a large population, these are necessary and the only way to get to work. And the designing team based this game and the title on a documentary of the same name from 1985 that describes the system. In general, drivers have debts regarding from operating these buses, and their payment is, rather than a set salary, it's based on the number of passengers they carry. So the more they work and the more passengers they have, the more they'll make, and which is familiar if you've taken Uber or Lyft these days. And the system itself incentivizes risky and unpredictable operator behavior. So they created these two prototypes, a top-down version, that's a two-player board game, and then this first-person digital prototype by incorporating a mixture of crazy taxi-like mechanics, but deeply connected them with debt management systems in the game. And so we felt like by asking our participants to consider narratives, perspectives, and viewpoints that aren't considered standard in games, especially games about Colombia, they arrived at a very interesting and fun game which we think can be generally accessible beyond this region. And across the games made over the workshop, we were able to avoid the stereotyped examples of corruption and narco-trafficking. And we feel, had we not engaged with these participants, our own games are in danger of falling back on these stereotypes. In fact, we made a mistake in the beginning of the workshop. It actually happened to be, the workshop discussion happened to be driven by our own external bias of what we thought would be important and interesting to our participants. So through the workshop, we collaboratively came up with game designs and provided critique to important and serious situations in a knowledgeable, respectful, and playful way. So outside of that bus game, we have prototypes about being LGBT allies in intolerant situations, managing ecologies, understanding the issues around economic trade-offs, and then also understanding the possible risks, particularly safety risks, in taking leadership roles in communities around Colombia and the Bogota area. So our experiences in Colombia help prepare us for the larger work that we're doing right now, which is about the US, and about a part of the country that's not always considered part of the US, Puerto Rico. And that's actually both from a mainlander and an islander point of view. Puerto Rico's status as a US territory and de facto colony of the US is a complicated and non-trivial manner, which through these next workshops, we actually hope to learn more. And so in Puerto Rico, we partnered with the NIUCO Center for Innovation at the Universidad del Sagrado Corazon to run a shorter one-day game conceptualization workshop. And this was 9 months after Hurricane Maria's landfall, in which the island was devastated not just by the effects of the hurricane, but compounded by existing debt issues already in place and imposed by the US federal government, and in particular PROMESA, a 2016 federal law that established an external austerity plan for the island. As such, when we started our workshop and started instead asking our participants what were they interested in, of course, the aftermath of all of this was very high in their minds. And our participants here came largely from a local internet technology company, and they were designers, artists, programmers, and managers. So in this one-day workshop, we spent half of our day outlining and organizing all of the possible issues that could be made into interesting gameplay that you can see up here. From considering the resources generated by the island and their distribution, and that's including human capital, which is increasingly leaving for the mainland and causing significant brain drain on the island. But also outlining the complex structures and impediments that are in the way for anyone trying to improve their lives while living on the island, such as unstable electrical grids, which 9 months later were still unstable, inequality, access to education, et cetera. And from there, we facilitated a rapid prototyping sketch activity where we made a number of different game ideas that played off of these themes. You can see on the left side of the slide. Each team would roll some dice to determine the kind of game that they were going to make. In this case, we chose storytelling, simulative, or abstract, emotive kinds of games. They would pick an issue to base the game on, and then concept a game or mechanic within a set time limit. We timed them to 10 minutes for each one of these ideas. The goal, we repeated the process until our heads and our hearts were drained. The idea here was to get a lot of different ideas down on the board. Because we took these ideas back to MIT for phase 2 of the prototyping process, where we work and continue to work to engage folks between the mainland and Puerto Rico to make one of these ideas into a distributable game that you could download or purchase. So back at MIT, we gathered game designers from the Boston area, including from the school, but elsewhere, to see what kinds of interactions we thought could be further developed. So back to that previous slide, the Puerto Rican context. Before we started prototyping as our group and before we even saw these ideas, we first had a session where we had to understand and provide the context from these issues to our mainlander and our non-American participants, and that was run by Aziria Rodriguez, who's currently a collaborator now at NIUCO. We also engaged in a lively discussion about who these games were being made for, and we had imagined who our players were. And a few of our participants, particularly Aziria, who came from Puerto Rico and felt that the games should be made for anyone interested in Puerto Rico. And that could be either from the US, internationally, or even someone on the island themselves. And we decided our players did not need to have an already informed background about the island. So from there, we went to a quick brainstorming session, ultimately forming 2 teams, making 2 different games, which we're going to talk to you about now.
So the first prototype is called Promesa, which is the name of the austerity law imposed on the island by the US government. And basically, just as in reality, the debt of Puerto Rico is impossible to pay back. And therefore, we made a game where instead of the players who work together trying to eradicate the debt, they try to eliminate enough of the debt, which is represented by cubes, on something that is a raft-like structure so that it can be pushed off the board which represents the island and thereby sail home back to mainland the United States where it belongs. And that would be the winning condition of the game. So players have to balance island needs like food, social services, healthcare, and education while battling enough of the debt so that it doesn't fall off the raft when it's being moved. And this is more of a risk-reward kind of element rather than a dexterity mechanic. So you don't want to push the raft until you're sure that nothing will fall off. There's also a tech tree of sorts in the game where you can unlock different infrastructure investments. The deck where you get your resources for all of this also holds setback cards, which can add an obstacle on the board, for instance, which you have to navigate around with the raft, or which represents setbacks in the political process that is ongoing right now. It can add more debt cubes or remove some of the other resources, the food, social services, health, and infrastructure, which represents a hurricane hitting the island.
And our second game focused on the dilemmas that the people of Puerto Rico face, particularly around creating local policy. And so we made a game, a very abstract mechanical prototype about what kind of local decisions can be actually made in Puerto Rico, and which people of varying interest all want to make policy decisions that are best for the island, but are ultimately restricted by the resources and the agency that they have. So we've thought of it as mostly a cooperative game, but it could also have gone semi-cooperative as well. And our current gameplay consists of each player having a hand of action cards that come from these 4 different draw decks, labeled here government, social capital, community, or economy. And each player has a role that gives them access to 2 of these piles to bring into their hand. So a teacher might have access to social capital and community cards, a housing justice advocate might get government and social capital, and a zoning board officer might get government and economy. And in the center are random policies that each have requirements. So if all the requirements are met based on the cards played in a round, that policy is then passed, and whatever consequences that policy enacts change the state of the board, almost like a tower defense style mechanic. It's very abstract. What we were trying to experiment with is what might lawmaking and policy look like in this kind of scenario. And so our next step is to actually play this prototype with people who have these real roles and see if the experience does ring true. Building off of that, one idea that came from both the Puerto Rico and MIT workshops is to actually map this to the political party system in Puerto Rico, which is largely defined not by liberal conservative divides, if you can even say the US system is defined that way, but instead in what relationship Puerto Rico should actually have with the US, be it as in statehood, a commonwealth, or the status quo, some kind of territory, or independence as an independent country. So in this scenario, the resources available to the players would change depending on these relationships. And so we're interested in how we can illustrate maybe the entropy that might exist within the system, the dilemmas that they face, but then also ultimately, this is the hard work, trying to point towards a possibly hopeful endpoint.
Okay, so what's next? Well, we are currently planning a collaboration with 1 or more Native American tribes in northern Maine because we want to expand the area we're looking at to the whole of the Americas. We are also working on securing funding for a Puerto Rican and a Native American visual artist to come and work with us on creating artwork for the prototypes that we are developing. We haven't chosen our collaborators yet, so I just chose to feature some artwork from Joe Cosme, who is an artist from Puerto Rico, who made a tarot deck with illustrations representing the events of the Hurricane Maria, and a Native American artist called Annette Lee, who makes star maps with star constellations as they are known by different Native American tribes. This one is from the Ojibwe tribe, for instance. So I would like to end the talk with a call to action for all the stakeholders who are represented here. We need something, I think, akin to the Coaster Proclamation. For those of you who don't know, in 1988, during the Nuremberg Toy Fair, on the initiative of Reinhold Wittich, 13 German game designers signed a proclamation written on the back of a beer coaster stating that none of us gives a game to a company if our names is not written on the box cover. So that's why we have the designers' names on box covers and call them designer games sometimes. We propose a manifesto where game industry stakeholders, designers, artists, publishers, producers, reviewers, content creators, vow not to engage with games created without proper cultural engagement. We're not saying that everybody can, that you can't make games about Puerto Rico or Native Americans without employing participatory game design methods the way we did. It's very resource consuming. But we do think that there is some kind of middle ground between where we are today and that, where you can engage with people in your own communities that have the appropriate cultural background that can help you, for instance, in schools and universities or just other community organizations that can help you avoiding cultural appropriation and other pitfalls of the colonialist mindset. Thank you. Oh, and we also want to thank CAST, Misty, and STEP for providing support for this project. Thanks. Okay, so we have 6 minutes and 53 seconds for questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, please step up to the microphone and speak directly into it.
Are there any games that you particularly recommend that handle this subject well, that are on the market, mass market games or anything like that?
Do you have a favorite? Oh, I'm be told to repeat the question. So, favorites that we think deal well with the issue at hand. For me, I think I would say Spirit Island is a really interesting game. It's a directly anti-colonialist game, but I still think that it doesn't give the native population of the island that much agency in what is going on. You are playing spirits that are affecting weather and so on. I really like to see agency in people who are being affected by the mechanics of the game. Did you have anything to add? Okay, thank you. Next.
Hey, in your photo montage of games, I saw you had Terraforming Mars up there as an example, and that's depending on what you believe in terms of intelligent life on Mars, would be a true kind of tabula rasa colonization game. Do you feel that that's an appropriate way of letting people sort of express that impulse for, you know, conquest and exploration and expansion, or is it just kind of subtly reinforcing the other issues?
Okay, so the question is, space colonialism, good or bad? Yeah, so it's hard for me to give a really succinct, short answer to that. What I think is interesting with Terraforming Mars is how much of the sort of old school 4X tropes that show up even in a game where they don't need to be there. We have indentured servants who are being sent into space to work in these colonies, for instance. It seems like even when we transfer the colonialist theme into the fantasy realm or space or somewhere else, we tend to still bring this mindset with us in a way that I don't think actually always saves the problem, although I love the game. So there's also that.
This may be a similar question in that when you are dealing with fictional colonialism in fantasy or sci-fi, if you don't have the resources in the local community to reach out and do the research, is it better to just throw it out entirely or make it very abstract, or is it better to try and engage and then work from feedback to see where you misstepped?
Okay, so the question is, if you don't have the resources to do the subject justice, you feel this yourself, should you abstract away the theme or make it very displaced, or should you just go for another theme? So this is maybe not really an answer to the question, but one of the things I've been thinking a lot about while doing this study is that there's so many games that haven't been made because we've been retelling this particular narrative over and over and over and over again. So I would say, see if there really isn't an more interesting story to tell that is more in tune with what our experience in life is here and now for us and for people around us. So I guess that's option B, like throw it out and try to think of something else.
Yeah, to piggyback, like I don't think you can't not make games about colonialism. It's kind of everywhere. It's part of everything. It's part of the DNA of our culture. So avoiding it is not the issue. Trying to, like, I would ask, why do you want to make this game? What are you trying to get out of it? What kind of story are you trying to tell? Is that story something that hasn't been told before? Then great, keep going and see where you can go. I had students make a game about the Emu War in Australia. So you're not hurting people, you're hurting emus. And the emus actually win. It's an insurgency game where the emus win, except for right after the Emu War when the technology gets even better. But even that, it's ignoring the people who were on the land before then. When we're talking about colonialism, when we're talking about land, there is no tabula rasa. There's always been something. And with Mars, I would look at the Kim Stanley Robinson series and how it talks about, even though there's no people on Mars, Mars is still Mars. Why would we change the state of it? Why would we change it for us? So it all comes back to that exploitive, we're taking advantage, we're taking control of these things. So if that's a story you want to tell, but if not, there's others.
And if I could piggyback on that in return, the reason that the Coaster Agreement was written was that the German game designers felt that they weren't being treated as well as authors from literature. And as you know, the word for game designer in German is game author. And they wanted to have that responsibility because they thought that their cultural artifacts were as important as literature or film or anything else. And I agree with that. I think it's really important what kind of stories we tell, even if we do it in game form. So I think it has to do with our view of the role of the designer as well, and the responsibility that comes with it when we create arguments that are manifested in these objects that traverse the world, and we aren't with it anymore, but it still keeps making that argument. So I think we should see that as a challenge. Okay, so I think we're out of time here. But if anyone wants to come and talk to us, we will be in the, what's it called? Catch-up room?
Wrap-up room?
Wrap-up room. It's not a room. We won't be wrapping anything up, but come
We'll be
see us there. And thanks again for listening.
Thanks for coming.